Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to talk about terminology associated with the endocrine system and the various hormones that are secreted by all of the endocrine glands. So we've already spent some time in our previous few videos talking about concepts associated with cell-to-cell communication, whether that communication is over a short distance or over a long distance. We saw a couple of common threads being that cells communicate with each other by sending messages in the form of signaling molecules across, again, either a short or a long distance, and those signaling molecules bind to protein receptors on or in the target cells. So what we're going to start focusing on here as we delve into the endocrine system is long-distance communication, of which endocrine signaling is one of two different types of long-distance signaling. So we've already covered that we have two types of long-distance communication that we can achieve in the body, one being neural communication, which will be the focus of future videos in which we talk about the nervous system, and then endocrine signaling, which is going to be our focus for now, in which cells communicate with each other by sending hormones through the bloodstream. In either case, if we compare neural communication and endocrine communication head-to-head, we can see, number one, both of these modes of communication occur over a relatively long distance. So we're talking about the brain communicates with the heart. Well, neither one of those organs is located remotely close to one another. So if cells in those two different locations are going to communicate with one another, that communication has to go over a relatively long distance. So in neural communication, and we'll get into the more specifics of this later on in a different video, when neurons communicate, they fire off action potentials, which are electrical in nature, and at the end of the action potential, the neuron secretes a neurotransmitter, which is our signaling molecule here, and that neurotransmitter binds to receptors on the target or effector cell, and then that cell, because of that engagement between neurotransmitter and receptor, will produce some sort of response or effect that is due to the change in that cell's behavior because of the engagement between ligand and receptor. In endocrine signaling, a group of cells that make up an endocrine gland synthesize and secrete a hormone, and that hormone goes from the interstitial fluid into the bloodstream. The bloodstream circulates all throughout the body and eventually determines where that hormone is going to go. So that hormone will eventually make its way to effector cells that have receptors for that particular hormone. And just like we saw with neural communication, the effector cell will produce a response because of the engagement between that hormone and the receptor. So what we can see here is that even though neural communication and hormonal communication look very different, they actually have quite a few things in common. Number one being that both occur over a long distance, and number two, most importantly, both require engagement between a signaling molecule, whether that's a neurotransmitter or a hormone, and a receptor on the target cell. Now, if we directly compare neural communication with endocrine communication, we can see that both in some way involve some kind of chemical signaling. Now, it's a little different with nervous system signaling because we tend to think of that as electrical in nature, and a big part of it is electrical in nature, but it still ends up being chemical because nothing is going to happen if the chemical neurotransmitter does not bind to the receptor on the target cell. The chemical signal we use in the endocrine system are called hormones, and we will more aptly define that here in a minute. And neurotransmitters are used by the nervous system. Endocrine signaling can occur over a relatively short distance, but usually the hormone will have to travel quite a long way using the bloodstream. The nervous system uses neurotransmitters that don't have to travel very far. If we back up just a second here, you can see that from the axon terminal where that neurotransmitter is released, it doesn't have to go very far to reach its effector cell. Now, with neural communication, this is still long-distance communication because the electrical message has to travel a long way, but the chemical message doesn't have to travel very far. In hormonal signaling, the chemical message does usually have to travel quite a long way to get to where it's going. As far as response time goes, endocrine response times can be fairly quick, but usually endocrine signaling takes a little while to get going. It takes time for the hormone to be made, it takes time for the hormone to be secreted, and more importantly, it takes time for that hormone to circulate through the blood to eventually find its target cells. So hormonal signaling is usually a little slow. Nervous system signaling is usually very fast. We tend to think of electrical messages being very fast, and that is true here as well. And another thing that's not listed here on this table but is worth mentioning is what we call duration of action. Once the message is received by the target cell and once it produces a response, how long does that response last? In the case of the nervous system, the response actually does not last very long. But in the case of the endocrine system, the response actually lasts quite a long time, mostly because it takes a little bit of time to clear the hormone out of the bloodstream. As long as that hormone is in the bloodstream, the effector cells will produce a response. This is part of the reason, if we go back to a discussion we had a long time ago on childbirth, we talked about how the hormone oxytocin binds to receptors on the smooth muscle of the uterus, and that produces the contractions that will eventually cause the baby to be born. Well, you'll often hear a lot of mothers after having gone through this say that, well, the contractions lasted for a little bit of time even after the baby was born. And that's because even though the baby has been born, we have accomplished our mission there. There is still oxytocin in the blood, and as long as there's oxytocin in the blood, the uterus is still going to contract. So those uterine contractions won't truly stop until that oxytocin gets cleared out of the blood. So that's what we mean by duration of action. With the nervous system, it's usually you get it started and it ends just as fast. But with the endocrine system, it might take a little time to get it started, but once you get it started, it's going to last for a good long while. Okay, so let's go ahead and define what a hormone is. A hormone is a signaling molecule that travels to its target cells through the bloodstream. It's those last three words that are most important. Through the bloodstream. A hormone is only a hormone if it travels through the bloodstream. If you have a signaling molecule that does not travel through the bloodstream, it is not a hormone. It's either a neurotransmitter or it's a paracrine signal of some kind. Hormones are defined by traveling through the bloodstream, so it's very important that you make sure you get that down. An endocrine gland is any organ or tissue or collection of cells that synthesizes and secretes a hormone. So we take that definition of hormone that we just put together and we apply it to an endocrine gland. A gland is any collection of cells that produces a signaling molecule that travels through the blood. Okay? So in this figure here, we can actually see a lot of what we tend to think of as the classical endocrine glands. By classical, we mean these are the glands we most typically associate with hormones, producing hormones, and being a part of the endocrine system. So we see the thyroid, we see the hypothalamus and pituitary, we see the pancreas, we see the adrenal glands, we see the uterus, the ovaries, the testes, the gonads. So these are the glands that when you think of hormones, when you think of the endocrine system, this is typically what you're thinking of. And these glands that we're looking at here are going to make up a lot of what we are going to study in this unit and in this chapter. So if we take a quick peek at some of the hormones that these different glands produce, this is just a quick glance for now. We are going to have future videos and future lessons dedicated to each one of these glands and the hormones that they secrete. So don't feel like you're getting off easy here just with this one table that you see. So the thyroid produces a few different hormones. Thyroid hormone, T3 and T4, has a major effect on our cell metabolism. Calcitonin, another hormone that is produced by the thyroid, helps to manage calcium regulation. We will talk about both types of hormones in the future. The pancreas, I'm sure you're already aware, produces insulin and glucagon, which aid in blood glucose homeostasis. The adrenals, which consist of both an outer cortex and an inner medulla, produce steroid hormones like cortisol and aldosterone in the cortex, and catecholamine hormones like epinephrine in the medulla. So a lot of these are going to help with things like stress response, especially cortisol and epinephrine. Aldosterone helps with management of sodium and potassium balance in extracellular fluid and also a little bit of blood pressure regulation. The gonads are going to produce sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. And then a big thing that we're going to be studying in the next few videos is the inner workings of the hypothalamus and pituitary. They actually produce quite a few different hormones. The hypothalamic hormones are called releasing and inhibiting hormones. The pituitary hormones are called trophic hormones, and these are going to function in regulating the production of hormones by a lot of these different glands up here. So look forward to our future discussion on that. Now look at this table here. So in this case, you're seeing the heart, the skin, the kidneys, the liver, the fat tissue. These are tissues and organs and glands that you would not typically think of as being a part of the endocrine system. These are not organs and tissues that you're going to be thinking of when you think of hormones. But even so, these organs and tissues do have endocrine activity. We call these the non-classical endocrine glands. So the way, if you go back to that slide where we defined what a hormone is and what an endocrine gland is, you have to remember the definition of an endocrine gland is any cell, group of cells, any tissue, any organ that synthesizes and secretes a hormone. The heart, the skin, the kidneys, the liver, yes, making hormones may not be their primary responsibility, but they still do it. So therefore, we still ascribe some endocrine activity to them. Now, these hormones are a little bit more esoteric in the sense that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about them, but it is worth understanding that just because you're talking about hormones, that doesn't mean that you're only talking about the pancreas, you're only talking about the thyroid. Now, in particular, I say these are kind of esoteric hormones, but we are going to see some of these hormones pop up later in the semester, particularly erythropoietin, which helps with red blood cell production, renin, which is a part of aldosterone regulation, angiotensinogen, which is also a part of aldosterone regulation, insulin-like growth factors, which we will talk about in a future video on growth hormone, and that's pretty much it. But the idea here is that any tissue can be endocrine as long as it synthesizes and secretes a hormone. That is a job that is not just dedicated to the thyroid, the pancreas, and so on. Okay, so here's a list of vocabulary terms you might want to be aware of for checking your understanding. Number 1, how is a hormone defined? Number 2, how do neural and endocrine signaling differ in terms of response time and duration of action? We talked about that earlier. Number 3, can any tissue in the body be endocrine in nature? All right, that's going to do it for this video. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments section. Otherwise, I will see you next time. So long.